I was sitting in a nursing home when I found my own house for sale on the internet. That was the moment I realized my son and daughter-in-law had never planned to bring me home. My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm 72 years old, and until 3 months ago, I lived in the same white colonial house outside Columbus, Ohio, that my late husband and I bought nearly 4 decades ago. It was the house where we raised our son Ethan. The house where we celebrated birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, and quiet Sunday dinners. Every room held a memory. Every creaking floorboard carried a piece of our family's story. When Ethan and his wife Rebecca first suggested that I move into a nursing home temporarily, they made it sound like an act of love. Rebecca sat beside me at my kitchen table, holding a cup of tea she barely touched. She spoke softly, carefully choosing her words. "Margaret, we're worried about you," she said. "You've been living alone since Harold passed away. We just want to make sure you're safe." Ethan nodded beside her. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes, but I assumed it was because the conversation was difficult for him. I never imagined there could be another reason. They told me it would only be for a little while, just until they could help organize some repairs around the house, just until I got used to not having Harold around, just until everyone felt comfortable that I wasn't alone. Looking back, I can still remember the exact moment I agreed. I was sitting in Harold's favorite chair near the living room window. The afternoon sunlight was spilling across the hardwood floor. I felt tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Losing a husband after 46 years of marriage leaves an emptiness that no one can understand until they experience it themselves. So when my son said he wanted to help me, I believed him. I trusted him because he was my son. 3 months later, I found myself sitting in a small room at Maple Grove Senior Living Center. The room was clean and comfortable enough, but it never felt like home. Home had Harold's photograph on the mantel. Home had the maple tree we planted when Ethan was born. Home had the kitchen, where I could still picture Harold reading the newspaper while I made coffee. Maple Grove had beige walls and scheduled meal times. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I was using the community computer in the activity room. I wasn't looking for anything important. I was simply browsing local news and real estate listings, the way I often did when I missed my neighborhood. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was a mistake. The photograph looked familiar. Too familiar. My heart began beating faster. I clicked the listing. There it was. The white colonial house. The blue shutters. The front porch Harold had rebuilt with his own hands. My house. My address. My home. Listed for sale. I stared at the screen for a long time. The listing described it as move-in ready. It mentioned the spacious backyard, updated kitchen, and quiet neighborhood. It did not mention the widow who still believed she lived there. It did not mention the promises made to her. It did not mention that she was sitting 20 miles away in a nursing home, looking at photographs of the life she thought was waiting for her. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I simply sat there and read every word twice. Then a third time, because deep down, I already knew the question that mattered most. If they planned to bring me home, why were they selling my house? I remained in front of that computer long after the screen dimmed. Around me, other residents moved through their afternoon routines. Someone was working on a puzzle near the window. A volunteer was helping another resident send an email to her grandson. Life continued as if nothing had changed. Yet I felt as though an invisible wall had suddenly cracked open, revealing something I had been too trusting to see. That evening, I returned to my room and sat quietly beside the small dresser where I kept the few personal items I had brought with me. Harold's photograph stood beside a ceramic bird we had purchased during a road trip through Vermont years ago. I picked up the frame and studied his familiar smile. For 46 years, Harold had been the person who noticed things before I did. He could sense when someone was being dishonest. He could hear uncertainty, hidden beneath confident words. More than once, he had warned me that I trusted people too easily. At the time, I considered that one of my strengths. That night, I wondered if it had become my greatest weakness. The more I thought about the past few months, the more small details began fitting together in ways they never had before. Rebecca had always been polite, but after Harold passed away, her attention toward me changed. She called more often. She asked unusual questions about insurance documents, property taxes, and maintenance costs. She repeatedly mentioned how difficult it must be for me to manage such a large home alone. At first, I appreciated her concern. Now, each conversation felt different when replayed in my memory. Ethan had changed too. My son used to call every Sunday without fail. After I moved into Maple Grove, those calls became shorter. Sometimes he seemed distracted. Sometimes he sounded rushed. Twice he canceled visits at the last minute because of work obligations. I had accepted every explanation without question because that is what mothers often do. We look for reasons to protect the people we love. We explain away things that do not feel right because the alternative is too painful to consider. The following morning, I made a decision. I would not confront anyone. Not yet. If there was an explanation, I wanted facts before accusations. After breakfast, I returned to the activity room and searched for the listing again. This time I paid attention to every detail. The property had been listed 18 days earlier. 18 days. That meant the house had been on the market for more than 2 weeks before I accidentally discovered it. My hands remained steady as I wrote down the real estate company name, the agent's contact information, and the listing number. Then I noticed something else. The photographs were recent. Very recent. Fresh flowers sat on the front porch. The living room furniture had been rearranged. Even the family photographs that once covered the mantel were gone. Someone had prepared the house for showings. Someone had been inside, making decisions about my home while I believed it was waiting for me. For the first time since arriving at Maple Grove, I stopped feeling confused. Confusion had been replaced by something far more useful. Questions. And I intended to find answers to every single one of them. The name of the real estate company stayed on the piece of paper in my hand for the rest of the day. I folded it carefully and slipped it into the small notebook I kept beside my bed. Then I waited, not because I was uncertain, but because I had learned something important over the years. People reveal more when they believe you know nothing. 2 days later, Ethan called. His voice sounded cheerful, almost rehearsed. He asked about my health, the food at Maple Grove, and whether I was participating in any activities. The conversation felt strangely formal, as though we were distant acquaintances rather than mother and son. I listened carefully. Not once did he mention the house. Not once did he ask whether I needed anything from home. Not once did he say when I might be returning. After we hung up, I sat quietly by the window overlooking the courtyard. Several residents were feeding birds near a fountain. The scene was peaceful, yet my thoughts kept returning to the same question. If Ethan truly believed he was helping me, why hide the sale? The following afternoon, Rebecca visited alone. She arrived carrying a bouquet of yellow flowers and a box of lemon cookies from a bakery she knew I liked. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect daughter-in-law. She smiled warmly and asked whether I was settling in. Then she began talking about the future. Not my future, hers. She mentioned home renovation trends, rising property values, and how expensive houses had become in our neighborhood. The words seemed casual, but I noticed something unusual. She spoke about my house as though it already belonged to someone else. At one point she caught herself and quickly changed the subject. Years ago, I might have ignored that moment. This time I did not. That evening I opened my notebook and began writing down everything I remembered. Dates, conversations, promises, small details that had seemed unimportant at the time. As the pages filled, a pattern emerged. The suggestions about moving had started only weeks after Harold's funeral. The discussions about maintenance costs became more frequent each month. The pressure to sign documents increased shortly before I moved into Maple Grove. I remembered one particular afternoon when Rebecca had placed several papers in front of me. She assured me they were routine forms that would allow Ethan to help manage household matters while I adjusted to my new living arrangement. I had trusted her explanation. Now I wished I had read every line more carefully. The next morning, curiosity led me back to the real estate listing. A new update had appeared. There was an open house scheduled for the coming weekend. My stomach tightened slightly, but my hands remained steady. Someone was actively trying to sell the place where my entire adult life had unfolded. Yet the strongest feeling was not anger. It was disappointment, because every new fact pointed toward a truth I had spent months refusing to consider. The people I trusted most were hiding something from me. And somewhere beneath all those missing answers was a reason they were so determined to keep me away from home. The open house was scheduled for Saturday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. For the next several days, I carried that fact with me everywhere I went. During breakfast, during afternoon activities, even during the quiet evenings when I sat by the window watching the sun disappear behind the trees. Every time I thought about strangers walking through my home, opening closets, inspecting rooms, and discussing prices, another memory surfaced. I remembered the spring Ethan turned 10 and insisted on planting tomatoes in the backyard. I remembered Harold spending an entire summer building the deck with his own hands. I remembered Christmas mornings when wrapping paper covered the living room floor and laughter echoed through every room. Those memories were not just attached to a building. They were attached to a life. A life that someone seemed determined to erase. The more I reflected on the past, the more details returned. At first they appeared separately, like puzzle pieces scattered across a table. Then they slowly began fitting together. About 6 months after Harold passed away, Rebecca started bringing up estate planning during family dinners. She spoke about it as though it were a practical conversation every family should have. She often mentioned how complicated things could become if older people did not prepare properly. At the time, I thought she was simply trying to be helpful. Then there were the questions about bank accounts, the questions about insurance policies, the questions about property taxes and utility bills. None of them seemed suspicious individually. Together, however, they painted a very different picture. One memory stood out more than the others. About 2 weeks before I moved into Maple Grove, Ethan had arrived unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon. He carried a folder filled with paperwork. I remembered feeling surprised because he rarely stopped by during the work week. He explained that several forms needed signatures to make things easier while I adjusted to temporary assisted living. I trusted him completely. I skimmed the pages and signed where he indicated. At the time, I barely looked at the details because I never imagined my own son would place something harmful in front of me. Now I found myself wondering exactly what those papers contained. Friday afternoon arrived. The open house was less than 24 hours away. I sat in the activity room pretending to read a magazine when my phone rang. The caller identification displayed a number I did not recognize. Normally, I would have ignored it. Something told me not to. "Mrs. Thompson?" a polite female voice asked after I answered. "This is Linda from Green Valley Realty. I am calling because there is a document missing from the property file, and I was told you might be able to help." For a moment, I said nothing. My heart began beating faster, but my voice remained calm. "What property file?" I asked. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "The sale of your residence, ma'am." I stared out the window toward the courtyard fountain. Residents continued feeding birds. The world remained perfectly normal. Yet with a single sentence, a stranger had confirmed what I had feared all along. There was no misunderstanding. There was no innocent explanation waiting around the corner. My house was being sold, and somehow, everyone involved seemed to believe I already knew. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Linda seemed to be waiting for me to confirm details that I had never been told. I finally asked a simple question. "Who authorized the sale?" Papers shuffled on the other end of the line. "According to our records, your son, Ethan Thompson, is acting on your behalf." I thanked her politely and ended the call before she could ask anything else. Then I sat motionless in my chair. Not because I was shocked anymore. The shock had already passed. What remained was clarity. Every strange conversation, every rushed signature, every vague promise about returning home, they all pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone had been making decisions about my life without my knowledge. That evening, I pulled out the notebook again and added everything Linda had told me. When I finished writing, I noticed another detail that bothered me. If Ethan was acting on my behalf, there had to be paperwork granting him that authority. I tried to remember exactly what I had signed before moving to Maple Grove. The harder I thought, the more frustrated I became. I could picture the folder. I could picture Ethan turning pages and pointing to signature lines. But I could not remember the titles of the documents themselves. The next morning, I decided to call him. When he answered, his voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Hey, Mom. Everything okay? I was just thinking about the paperwork I signed before moving here," I said casually. "Can you remind me what those forms were for?" There was a brief pause. Not long enough for most people to notice. Long enough for a mother. "Just routine documents," he replied. "Nothing important. Mostly things to help me handle logistics while you settled in. Would you mind sending me copies?" Another pause. This one slightly longer. "Sure," he said. "I will have to find them first." After we hung up, I stared at the phone for several moments. Ethan had never been a good liar. As a child, he could never hide the truth for more than a few minutes. Apparently, adulthood had not improved that skill very much. 2 days passed. No documents arrived. No email. No copies. No explanation. Instead, Rebecca called. She asked about my week and spoke enthusiastically about several upcoming renovations she and Ethan were considering. She seemed excited, almost relieved. Then she said something she probably did not realize would stay with me. You always said a house is just a building, Margaret. It is the people who matter. The words sounded harmless. Yet something about the way she said them felt rehearsed, as though she was trying to convince herself as much as me. After the call ended, I walked slowly through the courtyard garden behind Maple Grove. The afternoon sun was warm, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees. I sat on a bench and watched fallen leaves drift across the grass. For the first time in months, I stopped asking whether there had been a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. There was only a truth I had not wanted to see. And if I wanted answers, I could no longer rely on the people who were hiding them from me. I would have to find them myself. The answer arrived when I least expected it. 3 mornings later, the receptionist at Maple Grove called my room and told me there was a visitor asking for me. I assumed it was Ethan. Instead, I found an older gentleman standing in the lobby holding a leather briefcase. He looked familiar, though it took me a moment to place him. Then I remembered. Martin Hayes, the attorney who had worked with Harold for years. We had not spoken since my husband's funeral. His expression softened when he saw me. Margaret, he said quietly, I have been trying to reach you. We settled into 2 chairs near the lobby fireplace. Martin was never a man who wasted words. After a few moments of polite conversation, he opened his briefcase and removed a folder. I need to ask you something important, he said. Did you authorize the sale of your house? I looked directly at him. No. For the first time since arriving, I watched genuine concern appear on someone else's face. Martin lowered his eyes to the documents in front of him. That is what I was afraid of. A strange sense of calm settled over me. How did you find out? I asked. He explained that Harold had arranged for certain legal notices to be copied to his office even after his death. Normally, Martin paid little attention to routine property matters. But when he received paperwork connected to a pending real estate transaction involving my address, something felt unusual. He reviewed the file personally. The deeper he looked, the more questions appeared. There are documents granting authority to Ethan, Martin explained. I wanted to confirm that you understood exactly what you signed. I remembered the folder Ethan brought months earlier. The hurried explanations. The signature lines. Martin slid several copies across the table. I studied them carefully. There it was. A power of attorney document buried among other paperwork. My chest tightened slightly. Not because I was frightened. Because I finally understood how everything had happened. Ethan had been given authority to act on certain matters. Whether intentionally or carelessly, I had signed the document without fully reviewing it. Martin watched me quietly. There is something else, he said. He opened another section of the file. Your husband anticipated situations like this. I stared at him. Martin nodded. Several years ago, Harold updated portions of your estate planning. Certain protections were built into the trust structure. Any transfer involving the property still requires conditions that may not have been properly satisfied. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to hope. Not certainty, not victory, just hope. Martin continued speaking, outlining details I barely heard because one thought kept repeating itself in my mind. Harold had not left me defenseless. Even after his death, he had found a way to protect me. As Martin gathered the papers, he looked at me carefully. Margaret, until we understand everything, I suggest you tell no one about this meeting. I nodded. That advice suited me perfectly, because for the first time since discovering the listing, I was no longer searching blindly in the dark. And somewhere beyond all the missing answers, the truth was finally beginning to reveal itself. After my meeting with Martin, I returned to my room at Maple Grove and placed the folder inside the bottom drawer of my dresser. Then I did something that surprised even me. I waited. For years, I had believed that action was the answer to every problem. Call someone. Fix something. Explain. Confront. But Martin had been right. Sometimes the fastest way to learn the truth is to remain silent and watch what people do when they believe they are safe. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan and Rebecca became unusually confident. Their calls grew less frequent, yet strangely more relaxed. Ethan no longer sounded nervous. Rebecca seemed almost cheerful every time we spoke. It was as though a burden had been lifted from their shoulders. During one conversation, she casually mentioned that they had been shopping for new furniture. During another, she spoke excitedly about future travel plans. Neither of them ever mentioned my house. Neither of them asked whether I wanted to visit it. Neither of them discussed returning home. Their silence told me more than any confession could have. Meanwhile, Martin continued reviewing documents. Every few days he would call with another small piece of information. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Careful, methodical facts. The power of attorney I signed was real, but several actions taken afterward appeared questionable. Certain trust provisions required specific notifications. Other documents contained inconsistencies that raised concerns. Most importantly, the property transaction was not fully completed. The sale process was moving forward, but it was not beyond challenge. Each update strengthened something inside me that had been weakened since Harold died. Confidence. Not anger. Not revenge. Confidence. One afternoon, Martin invited me to his office. He spread several files across a conference table and walked me through them step by step. I appreciated that. Harold always believed complicated matters should be explained clearly. By the end of the meeting, one thing had become obvious. Ethan and Rebecca had been acting as though the outcome was already guaranteed. They had assumed nobody would ask questions. They had assumed I would remain at Maple Grove indefinitely. They had assumed the paperwork would move quietly from one desk to another until everything was finished. Assumptions can be dangerous things. As I prepared to leave, Martin handed me a copy of a document. I recognized Harold's signature immediately. My husband had signed it years earlier. At the bottom of the page was a clause designed specifically to protect family assets from improper transfers or misuse. I read it twice, then a third time. A small smile appeared on my face before I could stop it. Harold had known human nature well. He understood that circumstances change. People change. Temptation changes people even faster. Walking back to the parking lot, I looked up at the clear Ohio sky and felt something I had not experienced in months. Peace. Not because the problem had been solved. Not because justice had already arrived. But because I finally understood something important. Ethan and Rebecca believed the story was almost over. In reality, they had only reached the part where the truth begins to catch up with them. The call from Martin came on a Thursday morning. His voice was calm, but I could hear a note of satisfaction beneath the professionalism. The closing meeting is scheduled for next week, he said. Ethan and Rebecca planned to attend. I looked out the window of my room at Maple Grove. The maple trees were beginning to change color, their leaves turning shades of gold and red. Seasons moved forward whether people were ready or not. Do they know? I asked. No, Martin replied. And I believe it is best if we keep it that way. After we ended the call, I spent the rest of the day thinking about Ethan. Not the man he had become, but the little boy he once was. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle on the quiet street in front of our house. I remembered helping him with school projects at the kitchen table. I remembered the day he left for college and how proud Harold and I had been. Those memories hurt more than anything else. Not because of what was happening now, but because they reminded me of what had been lost along the way. A few days later, Rebecca called. She sounded happier than I had heard in months. She talked about restaurants she wanted to try and places she hoped to visit. At one point she laughed and said, "It finally feels like everything is falling into place." I agreed politely. Then I listened. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. She never once asked how I was feeling. She never asked whether I missed home. She never mentioned the future she and Ethan had arranged on my behalf. When the call ended, I sat quietly and folded my hands in my lap. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they have already won. The following Tuesday, Martin invited me to his office again. This time he reviewed the final details. Certain trust provisions had been formally raised. Additional documentation had been requested. Questions had been submitted that could not be ignored. Most importantly, the transaction could not move forward until those issues were resolved. What happens now? I asked. Martin closed the file carefully. Now we wait. The closing meeting arrived 2 days later. I was not there, but Martin told me everything afterward. Ethan and Rebecca arrived expecting routine paperwork and final signatures. Instead, they were presented with a series of legal concerns requiring immediate attention. Documents were reviewed. Questions were asked. Explanations were requested. The confidence they had carried into the room reportedly faded very quickly. By the end of the meeting, the transaction had been suspended pending further review. No funds changed hands. No ownership transferred. No celebration took place. That evening, I sat alone in my room as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. For the first time since discovering the listing, I allowed myself a small smile. Not because anyone had been embarrassed, not because anyone had been defeated, but because the truth had finally stepped into the light. And once truth appears, it becomes very difficult to push it back into the shadows. 3 weeks later, I stood in front of my house again. The autumn air carried the familiar scent of fallen leaves, and for a moment I simply stood on the walkway, looking at the place where so much of my life had happened. The white paint was still bright. The porch swing Harold built still hung near the front door. The maple tree we planted when Ethan was born had grown even taller. Some things changed slowly. Some things survived despite everything. Martin had spent those weeks untangling documents, reviewing records, and ensuring every legal protection Harold established was properly enforced. In the end, the trust provisions worked exactly as intended. The sale could not proceed. The authority that had been relied upon so confidently was not enough to bypass the safeguards Harold had put in place. The house remained exactly where it belonged, with me. Ethan called several times before I returned home. At first, I did not answer. Not because I wanted to punish him. I simply needed time. Eventually, I agreed to meet him. We sat across from each other in Martin's office. For the first few minutes, neither of us said much. Ethan looked older than I remembered. Tired. Uncertain. The confidence that had once surrounded him was gone. Finally, he spoke. He admitted that what began as practical discussions slowly became something else. Rebecca had convinced him that selling the house was the best solution. They talked themselves into believing they were helping me. Then they started making decisions without including me. One compromise led to another. One justification led to another. Eventually, they stopped asking what I wanted altogether. I listened quietly. When he finished, I asked only one question. Did you ever plan to bring me home? Ethan lowered his eyes. The silence that followed gave me my answer. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. Some truths do not require additional explanation. Rebecca never contacted me directly again. Perhaps she understood there was nothing she could say. Perhaps she finally realized that trust, once broken, is not repaired by excuses. I honestly do not know. And for the first time, I realized I no longer needed to know. The day I moved back into the house, I carried only 2 boxes through the front door. Most of my belongings had never left. The living room looked exactly as I remembered. Harold's photograph was back on the mantel. The afternoon sunlight still spilled across the hardwood floor. I walked slowly from room to room, touching familiar surfaces, remembering familiar moments. By evening, I found myself sitting in Harold's favorite chair near the window, the same chair where I had agreed to leave months earlier. Back then, I felt lost, alone, unsure of what the future held. Now I felt something very different. Not victory, not revenge, peace. Harold once told me that character reveals itself when people think nobody is watching. It took me a long time to understand what he meant. In the end, the house was never the most important thing. The most important thing was discovering the truth before it was too late. They believed I was too old to notice what was happening. They believed I would quietly disappear from my own story. They were wrong. And as the sun set beyond the maple tree outside my window, I realized something else. Harold had protected more than a house. He had protected my chance to come home.